Leon, fantastic question, because a lot of people struggle with this. A lot of people do not understand where ISO fits into the exposure triangle and how to control it in order to get the most out of their images. So I did a blog post, must be about a year ago or so, called What Should My ISO Be? Because it's a question I get a lot on Safari. What should my ISO be? I don't know. What do you want your shutter speed to be? Yeah? It's all of those. Those decisions are determined by what you want to create. So, your question, what is the difference between taking ISO up and down or exposure up and down, and how do they relate to each other? Work on this example with me. I shoot in aperture mode, which means I control my aperture. I select an aperture. The camera will then select a shutter speed to make sure that there's a certain exposure. Any change I make to aperture, the camera will make a same change in the other direction on shutter speed in order to maintain that exposure. So, if I want to change my shutter speed while in aperture mode, following? I cannot do that myself because I'm in aperture mode, which means I control aperture. If I want to make a change, for example, I dial in f8, my shutter speed is 1/10. I want f8, but I want 1/10 to be up. Then I would go and dial my ISO up, which will then make my camera more sensitive and which will pull my shutter speed up, still maintaining the same exposure. So in that situation, there won't be any change to exposure. It'll just get a faster shutter speed, helping me not to create soft and blurry images. If in that situation I dial in f8, I get 1/10, I take my ISO up, which will pull my shutter speed up to an acceptable level. If I at that point want to have a darker or lighter image, I would go and use exposure compensation. But that would again affect my shutter speed up or down. Yeah? You need to understand that relationship. If that didn't quite make sense, reverse it a little bit and watch it again. The idea behind exposure, and I don't use ISO necessarily to change exposure. Well, I do use it to do that, but for me it's more a thing about I focus on aperture first. That's my priority because that's where the storytelling is great. Then I make sure that my shutter speed is acceptable to create either a sharp image or a motion blur. And then I use ISO to pull that up and down. Should I want, for some creative reason, to over and underexpose, I would then use exposure compensation. So my decision making will then start from aperture first. I'll look at the scene and say, okay, I want to underexpose this. I will then underexpose using exposure compensation. I would then double check my shutter speed, and then, if necessary, I would use ISO to change that shutter speed if it's necessary. So, unless you're shooting in full manual, and if you are, Leon, please send me an email. You got my email. You sent this through on email. Tell me that you're shooting in full manual, because then you need to start comparing the variables. Because if you then just change aperture, the exposure will come down. Yeah? If you want the exposure not to come down, you would need to make that change to shutter speed. You need to do those two all the time in manual. And then ISO will allow you to change that shutter speed up or down because of the sensitivity. And then ISO becomes more of an influencer in the exposure game. Shooting an aperture, easiest thing. Focus on the storytelling, how much depth of field you want. Then check your shutter speed. Is it in relationship to your lens acceptable? You all understand that. And then, if necessary, use ISO to push that shutter speed up and down. Interesting question, and one, it's actually quite, I'm just thinking to myself, it's quite difficult doing it just talking here. What is nice is doing those kind of things in the field. So if you're ever in the office area, come and pop in for 10 minutes, bring me a coffee, there's a Vita downstairs, and we can have a quick look. Or then on a trip, we spend a lot of time doing stuff like this. But I hope that has a bit of clarity. I would always, personally, exposure compensation, that's what I would use to do my exposure up and down, and then just use ISO to help it move the shutter speed as required. Interesting one. I might have to watch that one again. My name is Gerry. I'm from Wild Eye. I will see you guys next time.